What's that? Is this a cyberpunk themed bar? Does it look like a cyberpunk themed bar? Well, there you go. People keep asking me that, like, cyberpunk this, cyberpunk that, or just a bar. Whiskey bar. Hey, how you doing? Hey, grab a seat. How you doing? Good? Yeah, it's not too bad. It's starting to slow down. Getting kind of late now, so not as many people coming by. What brings you to the bar this hour? You couldn't sleep? I mean, I guess alcohol will make you drowsy, but I wouldn't really suggest it as like a sleeping aid. If you want, I can grab you a cup of water and probably help wake you up. You want to do that? I usually suggest a cup of water with your whiskey anyways, because it's important to stay hydrated. You want ice? No? Alright. My name's Josh, by the way. Nice to meet you. Let me know if you have any questions. Alright. I'm just going to put your water right here for you. Do you want to see the menu? Or is there something catch your eye here? Yeah, well, you can be honest with me. What's up? You've never had whiskey before. Okay. So, just to recap, you couldn't sleep, so you got out of bed, got into your car, and thought that would be a good time to try whiskey. No, I don't blame you. It will get your mind off things and help you relax. So I'm not judging. I usually get paid just to pour the liquids from those bottles into a glass, but I guess I can give you like a rundown, a little whiskey 101, help you learn something, and get you on your whiskey journey. Do you know anything about whiskey? Yep, distilled alcohol. Yeah, it's a distilled fermented grain mash, so before it's distilled, it's kind of like beer in a sense. They both come from a mash of sometimes malted barley or corn, rye, and wheat. Usually the typical grains that are used in there. The difference with whiskey is obviously the distilling process. You're going to heat the liquid to a vapor and then condense it back into liquid form, and that's what gets you those high alcohol percentages on a whiskey versus like a beer. And then if you've heard of like moonshine or white dog, sometimes it's called white whiskey, those are just terms for unaged whiskeys. Yeah, those are before they get put into the oak cask, so they're going to be clear and not the typical brown liquid that you would associate with whiskey. Yeah. What's the difference between all these guys? There's a lot of differences that make one whiskey different from the other. Basically the grains that you choose to use, how much barley or wheat, corn, and rye that is involved in the recipe, and your aging process, how long it's aged for, the way you distill the liquor, and also if you're going to blend your whiskey, that can totally change the product before it ends up into the bottle. So there's an endless supply of different types of whiskeys, and if you want to, go on a journey and try every single type of whiskey you can, it's going to take a while, but you'll have fun. So Guess you could start today, right? Yeah. Yeah, the other thing about these whiskeys, you may have heard of something called like a bourbon, something called a scotch. Those themselves are whiskeys. They're just specific types of whiskeys. It's kind of like, have you heard of champagne? Yeah, so champagne is just like a sparkling wine that can only be made in Champagne, France. So those, bourbons and scotches are like that. They basically have to follow strict guidelines to be named those things. Like for scotch, for instance, you're gonna have to distill and age your whiskey in Scotland. You're gonna have to make it from malted barley, or have to include malted barley, and age it for at least 3 years in a barrel. Also, they only allow the additives of water and something called E150A, which is just a fancy technical term for like a caramel food coloring. So that's one thing. If you don't know much about whiskey, you're at the store or a bar and you see all these different colored whiskeys. Some are darker, some are lighter, and you think if something looks really dark and rich and intriguing, that doesn't necessarily mean it's any better than a lighter colored whiskey, because they are adding these food colorings to the scotch. You don't really know if that color is authentic or not. Now some bottles will specify and they will say no added coloring on there, and you'll know for sure that what you're getting in the bottle. But other times it's impossible to tell. So don't base a whiskey just on its color, because it can be deceiving. Bourbon, on the other hand, are you familiar with bourbon? I'm sure you are. It comes from America. So, yeah, like scotch, if you want to call it bourbon, you have to make it in America. People think it's only Kentucky, which does have a ton of bourbon. I think like 95% of bourbon is made in Kentucky, but legally, you can make it anywhere as long as it's in America. Yeah, you can do Hawaiian bourbon. I don't know if it's a thing, but legally, yeah, you can do that. The other guidelines you'd have to follow for a bourbon is you have to age this bourbon in a new charred oak cask. So every time you want to make a bourbon, it has to go into a new cask. You cannot reuse the same cask that you used for a previous batch. This plays a huge role in the flavor profile of a bourbon and the differences between bourbons and, say, scotches. Bourbons are going to not have any additives. You can't add any sort of coloring to a bourbon. You can add water, but that's it. But the coloring on a bourbon is going to be authentic. So generally they're actually pretty dark though, because of that new oak that you're putting them in. Yeah. No, I know I'm sorry, I'm throwing all the information out there at you. I just, I want you to know what you're getting into. Some people, they just, come in, ask for house whiskey and mix it with some soda. Just fine, I guess. Honestly, if you have to mix soda with your whiskey, I would say you probably just don't like whiskey. That's my opinion, but everyone's got their own tastes. I just think you should really appreciate the whiskey for what it is and not try to mask the flavor with a bunch of sugar and nonsense that doesn't really enhance the whiskey in any way. Right. Yeah. What's your typical go-to? What do you normally drink? Okay. Hard seltzer. Those are pretty popular. I would say, yeah, I wouldn't go straight into drinking whiskey neat if you're if you're used to drinking those. I'm trying to do like a little cocktail for you, mixed drink, and trying, something that's not too diluted, so the whiskey's still gonna shine. And yeah, since we're in America, I think we should definitely go with bourbon for your first whiskey. And with the guidelines to make a bourbon, I forgot to mention that you also have to use at least 51% corn in your mash. So the grains have to at least be 51% of corn grain, and that's gonna play a big factor into the flavor profile as well. So with these guidelines and certain criteria that has to be met for a bourbon, you have this core flavor profile that you can kind of expect when you pick out a bourbon. And you say, you don't know the labels, you don't know the distillers, but it says bourbon on it, so you can expect certain things, like it's gonna have like a vanilla, you're gonna get some baking spices like cinnamon, cardamom, you might get some sort of citrus, you can also get like a toffee or a caramel flavor. These are just kind of core flavors which are imparted from the sweet corn ratio. And then that new charred oak, the barrel, plays a big influence as well. Yeah. Let me show you a couple different bottles just to give you examples of what a bottle of bourbon would look like and what some of the terms on the labels will indicate, and kind of just give you a little rundown of what you can expect or what to look for when looking at bottles of whiskey. Yeah. So another guideline for legally calling something bourbon, as you know, you have to age it in those barrels for at least 2 years. If you age it for less than 4 years, you actually have to state that on your label. So if you see something like this, and it just says, Woodford Reserve Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, there's no sort of age anywhere on here. It tells you your percentage, 45.2% alcohol. It has to be at least 40% to be considered whiskey, but nowhere on here does it say anything about age. So what that means is it's at least 4 years old. If it was over 4 years old, they would probably tell you. Generally, people pay more money for bourbons that have been aged longer, and people look for those because it just adds deeper flavor and just a more mature influence of the oak onto the bourbon. Some people think it makes it smoother. And it's true to a degree. The shorter a bourbon is aged, like that white dog or that moonshine that goes into the barrel before it becomes the whiskey, it's pretty potent. So if you don't give it enough time in the barrel to sort of mellow out, it can be a little aggressive and quite harsh to drink. So, but 4 years is pretty decent amount of time for a commercial whiskey, and to mass produce something like this that's you can find anywhere. Now, I do have something that is under 4 years. Let me show that to you, just to show you what it looks like on the label. Alright, so this is called Hudson Baby Bourbon Whiskey. You could probably take a guess by the name, Baby Bourbon. It's going to state right here on the label, aged under 4 years in American oak. So that is, because you legally have to state that on the bottle. If it's not at least 4 years, you'll know, okay, well, it's at least 2 years, because it says it's a bourbon, but it's not 4. So this one says aged under 4. I guarantee it's probably exactly 2 years or just a little bit over. So, and you can tell just from the 2 years that it was in the barrel. The color on this is actually still pretty good. Like it's very dark, and that's all from the wood. There's no added coloring or anything on here. So even in 2 years, the wood can impart quite a bit onto the whiskey. Let me show you, for instance, a Scotch that was probably aged in obviously a second or third use barrel, and you'll see the color is quite drastically different compared to this one. Okay, so this is actually a 9-year, aged 9 years, and the color differences is quite noticeable. So, when it comes to bourbon, the aging process, just based on the color here, it can take over, the flavor of a bourbon pretty quickly. So you don't typically see really old aged bourbons, like 25, 30, 40-year bourbons. You don't find those. The reason being is after a certain amount of years in that new barrel, you're gonna just start to lose any sort of flavor from the actual liquid, and it's just gonna turn into all wood. You're gonna taste the liquid, and it's gonna taste like you're licking a tree. And some people are into that, but yeah, you can quickly ruin a bourbon by over aging it. So some people think any whiskey, the older the better. That's not always the case. So, but when it comes to Scotch, those, you see a 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old Scotch, those are, legitimately aged and well worth seeking out and tasting, because what they do is they're using like a second used barrel or a third fill. So these are barrels that have already had liquids maturing in them previously, and then the oak is not going to impart as much of a flavor or play that big of a role into the flavor profile at the end. Hey, yeah. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, what can I do for you? Sure. What do I suggest? Do you like rye whiskey? Okay, cool. Yeah, we got a nice rye whiskey. I would suggest that we'll get you right into that Christmas spirit. It's actually a limited release that comes out around the fall time, and it has great notes of plums and cinnamon and all sorts of Christmassy flavors, and it'll definitely get you into the Christmas spirit if you want to give that a go. Yeah, I'll pour you some. Grab that. So this is actually a pretty neat whiskey around this time of year. There's a distillery called High West Distillery. I believe it's out of Utah, and they make this whiskey called a Midwinter's Night's Tram, and it's kind of a take on Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night's Dream. It's a special type of rye whiskey. It's actually a blend of a couple different ryes that they make, and they age them in French port casks. So these are, wines. They're basically dessert wines and have a lot of dark fruit flavors. And when you put this rye whiskey into these barrels, you'll start to extract some of those flavors, and it turned into a pretty delicious blend. I can read you kind of their little spiel here about the marketing and in their flavor descriptions here. So it says, the rye forms a beautiful base of vanilla, caramel, and cinnamon. It says the port barrels made from French oak enhance with notes of plums, dried fruits, and provide a spice accent. And it says, for us, a Midwinter Night's Dram tastes like a proper Christmas plum pudding with lovely mulling spices, dried fruits, and creme anglaise. So, yeah, this is a really cool whiskey. I would suggest to probably just drink it neat. If you come back before the holidays, I definitely would give it a shot. If you know someone who's into whiskey and you're looking to get them a cool Christmas gift, this would be a great gift to get them. Yeah, so the differences between, say, like something called a rye whiskey versus a bourbon, they're actually pretty similar as far as the guidelines go. You just have to use at least 51% rye in your mash bill. Most of the whiskey makers, or rye whiskey makers, are probably using more than 51%, just to make sure the rye is actually significantly different than a bourbon would be. Here's a good example of a really good rye whiskey. It's made by Pikesville. It's 110 proof, and that is 55% alcohol, so it's pretty high. And on the back you'll see it says this whiskey is aged at least 6 years. So that's a good thing. You definitely want something aged for a decent amount of time. You can find ryes that are 2, 3, 4 years old, and they can be a little aggressive, a little too harsh. The flavor differences on a rye is they're generally more spicy and fruity versus that kind of sweet caramelness you get from the bourbons. So usually if you're getting a cocktail and it has rye whiskey as the base, it's generally going to be a drier type of cocktail versus a bourbon based cocktail. It's going to be a little sweeter. So depending on what your palate prefers, you can choose what kind of whiskey base you want to use for your cocktail. I do want to show you one other example of like a bourbon bottle or bourbon bottling, just to show you some of the things on the label that you might see down the road. Alright, so this guy is called Eagle Rare. It says Kentucky Straight Bourbon. So, based on that information, we know it is a bourbon that has been aged for at least 4 years, unless it states otherwise on the bottle. So if you look at the back here, it does tell us aged 10 years. So we do know for a fact this has been aged for 10 years. Now, if a distiller for some reason blends a 10-year-old whiskey with a 11-year-old whiskey and maybe a 12-year-old whiskey, and they blend it all together, once they put in the bottle, they have to put the age of the youngest whiskey on the bottle. So even though there may be something a little older than 10 years in here, they would have had to put that 10 years, just so you know. They can't say they put a splash of, this 15 year in here, so now it's saying it's 15. It doesn't work like that, so it guarantees you that all whiskey in this bottle is at least 10 years old. But the other thing about this bottle is right here. Single barrel select. So what that means is all of the liquid in this bottle comes from one single barrel of whiskey. So generally when you find a regular labeled whiskey or like a mass-produced whiskey, they're going to be a blend of that distiller's choice of barrels. So to keep a product tasting consistent, they would grab a few batches of barrels and then blend them to the appropriate ratio so they meet that target flavor profile of whatever label they're bottling. So for instance, Eagle Rare, it's going to have a base flavor that you will come to know and expect by drinking just the regular base. If you like that base profile and you want to explore some different nuances of that, you can look for a single barrel and see what kind of expression that one barrel is showing, and you can go out and buy several different ones and compare them to each other. So it can be a lot of fun trying to do side by sides with different single barrels and seeing if you can pick out the differences in each of those. So it's a fun thing to do if you're into that. Okay, so you're probably getting thirsty by now. Let me go ahead and make you your drink. What I want to do is make a take on a Manhattan. So traditionally, a Manhattan, you would use rye whiskey for the base. And what you would do is you mix basically 2 parts whiskey with 1 part vermouth. In this case, the traditional would be 2 parts, or say 2 ounces of rye, and then 1 ounce of sweet vermouth. And vermouth is a fortified wine, which is basically just a table wine that has been fortified, or they've added neutral grape spirit to enhance the alcohol percentage, and also added botanicals and different spices to add different aromatics. Other things that would be in the Manhattan would be a dash of bitters and a cherry garnish. So I do want your first whiskey drink to be a bourbon though. So instead of doing the rye and the sweet vermouth, we're going to swap out the rye for a bourbon. And instead of using sweet vermouth, which we already know a bourbon-based cocktail is going to be sweeter by, the bourbon alone, we're going to use a dry vermouth. And that's going to help balance out the sweetness from the bourbon. So I'll go ahead and get that ready for you. And you just sit tight. Let's see. So for your base bourbon, let's go ahead and use that Woodford Reserve. It's a pretty good whiskey for a cocktail. So we're going to use 2 ounces of this. And this is what a dry Vermouth would look like. This one actually says extra dry. This is a good brand that I would recommend if you're looking to make one of these cocktails at home. So we're going to use about 1 ounce of this guy. These are your aromatic bitters. We're just going to add about 1 to 2 splashes of this for added flavor. And then the cherry for garnish. You can also actually put some cherry juice in the cocktail as well if you like to sweeten it up a little bit more. Why is it so long? That's what she said. Well, no, it's just to help stir a little better, you know. Helps with the leverage. All right. Did you fall asleep? I did talk a lot about whiskey. They were pretty tired when they showed up, so yeah, I'm sure they'll wake up soon. I'll just leave this here for them.